Hello, everybody. It is Tuesday, January the 28th, New Book Day. And a new book by my old friend Nicholas Carr is always a big event. Of course, he's the author of The Shallows, which I think was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Lots of other great books, including The Glass Cage and The Big Switch and Does IT Matter? The book is entitled Super Bloom: How Technologies of Connection Tear Us Apart. And I'm thrilled that through modern technology, even if it's tearing us apart, Nicholas Carr is joining us from his home in Massachusetts. Nick, congratulations on the new book, Super Bloom. Tell us what this book's about.
Well, this book looks at how digital media is reshaping society. So back 15 years ago, I wrote the book The Shallows, which you mentioned, which looked at how the internet was changing the way we think and changing the way, I argued, our minds work. And one thing I didn't cover in that book was the societal changes that the technology was producing. And for a simple reason, I thought the evidence, both scientific evidence and experiential evidence, was too early. And so there were a lot of mixed signals. Social media was still kind of a new phenomenon. Smartphones were a new phenomenon. So I've always, in the back of my head, I've always wanted to come back and talk about the social effects of the technology. And certainly over the last 10, 15 years, those have been much more pronounced, much more controversial. So I argue that our assumptions about technologies of communication, which is that we want them to advance as quickly as possible because we believe that the more we communicate, the more we'll understand each other, more we'll all get along, is actually fundamentally wrong, in that when you communicate too much, as I think we do today, you don't bring people together. You actually start tearing them apart. And that has to do with what I see as a fundamental conflict between the technology and human nature.
These tech books, which are critical, always seem to have an element, Nick, of nostalgia about them. This idea that technologies of connection, and in particular, you're writing about social media technologies tearing us apart, does assume that there was a time when we weren't, so to speak, torn apart. Is that a fair criticism? Do you look back historically and think, oh, that was a time when we weren't torn apart?
Well, I do look back, and in the book I do. I spend quite a bit of time on the history of electric communication, going back to the telegraph, to try to understand why in the last century communication technologies, which were moving forward very quickly, why they had, I think, a different effect than digital technologies have had in our own century. And so I like to think that, I mean, you're absolutely right that there is, in some books that are critical of technology, a kind of nostalgic tone. But the question is, when you look back and you make a comparison between before and now, is it just nostalgia, or were there real differences? And did they make a difference in how we communicated to each other, how we interpreted each other, how we processed information? And I would argue that the differences are real, and they're not just a nostalgic fantasy. And, it makes a lot of sense, I think, to go back and get some historical context, because these days we're so convinced that, the new world is so completely different than it used to be, that we lose sight of the fact that there are antecedents for everything. We can learn a lot by looking into the past. And so I think it's a useful exercise, actually.
You mentioned the invention of the telegraph. I think the famous phrase, and you know this stuff a million times better than I do, but the famous phrase from its inventor is, "What have we unleashed?" Was that the first thing he said?
Yeah, something like that. I think God was involved.
Yeah. So, and similar probably to what Oppenheimer said when he supposedly invented the nuclear bomb. But coming back to the criticism, Nick, of this nostalgia of tech criticism, every time anything new is invented, whether it's a nuclear bomb or the internet or the telegraph, we always fear what we've unleashed. And then when we look back, we always smile rather sadly and think, well, whatever comes next is even more dramatic. Why should we believe that the technologies of today, which you believe are tearing us apart, won't be looked back in 50 or 100 years and think, wow, that social media age was one when we really were together?
Well, I can't. I'm not that good at projecting. I'm not a futurist, put it that way.
Well,
But
you are implicitly, whether you acknowledge it or not. You're writing about the technologies, quote unquote, of the future, even if they're today.
yeah, to some extent. But I mean, it's very, very hard to know what in 50 years how people will look back. I mean, maybe it'll be much worse then. So this will seem like a golden age. I don't know. But when a new technology, as you say, when a new technology comes along, and particularly if it's a media communication type technology, there is kind of there's one reaction which says, oh, this is going to ruin everything. But then there's an opposite reaction that says this is going to solve all our problems. We will enter this kind of utopia of understanding. And you see that over and over again with media and communication advances. So you saw it with the telegraph, you saw it with the telephone. People like Marconi, Tesla, both said that they would be known for ending all wars because they were inventing these technologies of communication. And if we communicate all the time, we must get along. It's inevitable that we'll all get along. And that didn't work. And you look at the 20th century, it's certainly told a different story than the abolishment of war. But it wasn't, I would argue that the digitization of communication, the digitization of media has created a new environment for us all, a new social environment, a new intellectual environment, a new cultural environment that is extremely different than what we experienced 40 or 50 years ago. We now, everybody's, for a long time, people have said, well, media creates this new environment. Marshall McLuhan was saying it. Neil Postman was saying it. But it's only recently, in the last 20 years or so, that we've carried, in the form of a smartphone, constantly connected to all these social media platforms and all sorts of messaging systems and everything, that we've carried this environment around with us all the time, that we're constantly using our phone or thinking about using our phone. We've created this world in which we can socialize all the time. We can socialize with many different groups of people simultaneously. This is a radically different way of socializing than I would argue human beings have evolved, the way we've evolved to socialize. And certainly we're extremely social beings, and that's why we love being on our phone all the time, because we want to know everything everybody's talking about, particularly if they're talking about us. But we evolved, I think, to socialize in the real world, the physical world, where you'd be in a room with other people, you'd talk to them. Sometimes you'd be quiet. Sometimes you would talk, and then that event in your life, that social event, would stop, and you'd go somewhere else. And maybe you were by yourself in your car or in your bedroom or whatever, and you'd have time to look back on the experience and think about it calmly. And then you'd go somewhere else and you'd be with a different set of people and you'd socialize then. And so there's these temporal, spatial boundaries to our social lives. And I think we kind of ignore them because they just seem so natural. But I think we underestimate how important those kind of borders were. And now we've created this new social environment where there are no borders and everybody is talking all the time. We're processing messages and sending out messages kind of continuously. And I think this just overwhelms us. And kind of, as I write in the book, drawing on some things we know about the human psyche, that getting lots more information about people and expressing yourself constantly actually doesn't tend to bring people together. It tends to create abrasive situations where people start emphasizing what's different about them and other people, and it tends to create enmity. It tends to create sometimes aggression, and I think all of those things are things we see today in our politics, in our intimate social lives, and they all come. I think that they all come from this, this basic tension between our psychology, our psyche, and a communication system now that is just overwhelming.
Nick, you talk about reality. You quote Baudrillard in the book about hyperreality. One of the things that occurred to me reading the book, and as always, I have to commend you. It's an excellent book, very thoughtful, full of excellent observations, and as always with your work, wonderfully researched. Why is hyperreality, which now, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, you seem to suggest that we live in something called hyperreality. There was a woman who came on my show about 15 years ago, Jane McGonigal. She wrote a book called Reality is Broken. You touch on that. Why I'm trying to maybe express myself clearly here. Why isn't hyperreality any more or less real than pre-hyperreality? Does that make sense as a question?
Yes. And, whenever you talk about reality, you can make the argument that everything's reality by definition. Right. And so you can get lost in the weeds. But I mean, what Baudrillard was saying is that there comes a point when you are so adapted to communicating through media, through experiencing the world through media, that you begin your reality, and you can use that, your reality becomes detached from the world as it is, the physical world. And you not only do you experience things through media or as if they're through media, as a flow of images, a flow of text or whatever, but even when you're not online or looking at your computer, you're experiencing the world as if it were coming through a screen. And so as he explains it, we tend to think of media images and words in books and stuff as representations of something that is actually real in the world. They have a referent that is reality. And his argument was, at some point, you're so used to experiencing the world as a flow of media images and experiences that the stuff is no longer is attached to. It's no longer a representation of something in reality. It becomes your reality. And for instance, the book is called Super Bloom because it refers to an event in Southern California in 2019.
Right, Riverside. We got some images. They're wonderful images, and it's a wonderful way of framing the book. But why aren't they any more real than anything else in nature?
Oh, the super bloom is real. But what happened is, as soon as pictures started circulating online, people rushed into the canyons where these beautiful flowers were blooming, and with their phones, and their goal was to create images of themselves, selfies or videos or whatever, with this beautiful natural phenomenon as the backdrop. And so you see them trampling the flowers, ripping the flowers up, all to get these pictures. And there are photographs of these beautiful canyons overwhelmed with people all with their phones out. And to me, that's an example of hyperreality, where they weren't there to experience the world as it is, the actual flowers blooming. They came with the image, the media image of this place foremost in their minds, and their goal was to join in that media experience by taking their own photographs with the flowers as a backdrop. So their experience of the whole phenomenon was an experience of it as a media creation, not as something in the natural world. And I think, to me, that's a good microcosm of what we see today, and even a metaphor of how people increasingly experience the world and experience each other as content, as media images. And as soon as you do that, then your relationship to people, your relationship to the world, your relationship to reality, however you want to define reality, is very, very different.
But haven't philosophers historically observed this and been concerned about it? I mean, I'm not an expert on Heidegger, but my understanding of Heidegger is he warned us about this, and he was writing before the existence of the internet.
Sure. I mean, and he, his work, his late in his life on technologies is quite interesting. And I think this is different from Baudrillard and hyperreality, but similar in a way. Heidegger suggested that as the world becomes more and more technologized, we start to look at it we start to look at things in the world not for their own qualities and for their own value, but as something we can use technologically. So you look at a river and you see not the river, but you see a source of power, of hydroelectric power. And so he believed that we're so incorporated into the technologized world that we start to see everything as a resource that we can exploit technologically for our own gains. And I think, I think that is an important way to think about technology in general. And I think it is applicable to, for instance, what we saw with the super bloom. People weren't experiencing the flowers and the natural phenomenon as a natural phenomenon.
So if you were there, I can imagine you, Nick, if you were there or your kids were there, would you have told them to, in this incredible super bloom, would you say, put away your phones, enjoy the flowers as they are? I mean, how should we deal with this remarkable phenomenon of the super bloom? I have to admit, if I'd have shown up, I probably, and I'm not a big I'm certainly not on social media, but I would have started taking photos because isn't that kind of the natural thing to do?
Sure. And if people had gone there and they had their camera or their phone and taken pictures, sure, it's completely, it's what people do when they have a recording device and they're in something that is beautiful or very impressive. But this was more than that. The whole experience began with people seeing the images online, on Instagram in particular, but also I'm sure on YouTube and stuff, and imagining themselves as part of this. So there was never, they were there to be part of a media experience, which is, I think, very different.
It's the spectacle, or the media becomes the spectacle. Your book has already been very well reviewed. The Wall Street Journal liked it, but there was one reservation which suggested you were a bit anti-Trump, anti-Elon Musk, who isn't these days. But I wonder whether Trump himself is an example, if reality is broken or if hyperreality is the new reality. Is Trump a manifestation of the super bloom personality in this new world, for better or worse? I mean, I'm no bigger fan of Donald Trump than you are, but do we have to acknowledge that this is, for better or worse, the new reality?
I think so. I mean, I grew up in the 1970s in Connecticut, and we used to I remember my parents, we were kind of on the edge of where you could get broadcasts from New York City. So we used to watch the 10 o'clock news on Channel 5. I remember this clearly in the late 70s. And Donald Trump was already kind of a media fixture. He loves being on TV. He loves, and he already, even back then, he felt like kind of a person who simply exists on TV and exists in media. And I don't think that's actually changed. I mean, to me, the world as we adapted to constant media exposure and politics went online and everything else, the world kind of went toward Trump's reality. And so if you think of memes, I think Donald Trump fundamentally is a meme.
Yeah, I mean, he's Chauncey Gardner, and this has been written about before, of course, put on a wonderful film, Being There. I mean, what's different about this? What's different from Trump and social media and Instagram and Chauncey Gardner and Being There?
Yeah, well, I mean, Chauncey Gardner was Trump talks more than Chauncey Gardner did, and he does have political positions and stuff. But I do think in many ways he becomes a meme, both for his opponents and for his supporters. And it shows how what we thought was going to be a democratized media is actually very, very good to generate cults of personality, because you become this image in that people on both sides of you fill it with their own hopes and dreams. You become this kind of larger than life figure. And so I think that's what we see. And I think increasingly we're seeing, our politics play out through memes, through images, through what we call vibes. Today we saw it, not just with Trump, but with Kamala Harris as well. So yeah, I think this is, unfortunately, I think, because if, we've never, it's been a long time since people thought deeply about complex issues, and we've always tended to be kind of reactive in our political lives. But I certainly think it's much exaggerated now. And it's interesting. I mean, one thing that's interesting to me is I'm not a particularly political writer. In fact, I try not to be, because I know these days you alienate some people and attract others. But my critique of Silicon Valley has really been quite consistent, And so 10 or 15 years ago, when I was criticizing people like Elon Musk or Mark Andreessen or whatever, it tended to be people on the right that agreed with me because they distrusted Silicon Valley and they thought, it was controlling dialogue and debate to screen out conservative views. And the left was kind of suspicious of me because they still bought into this dream of democratized media. And now I'm still saying, I'm still making the same critique, but now because Musk and Andreessen and Zuckerberg have made this big shift from the left to the right, it's the people on the right who don't want to hear them criticized and the people on the left who do. So I think I've been pretty consistent, but the whole political landscape has changed as Silicon Valley has shifted its own politics.
It's interesting you talk about Mark Andreessen. He tends to be in the news today. He's talking about a Sputnik moment when it comes to AI. You have an interesting a couple of paragraphs in the book about something you call reality privileged, or maybe what Andreessen means by reality privileged. A new kind of elite. Is there going to be a social order, Nick, in the future, in our age of super blue media, where the rich and powerful like Mark Andreessen have a different sense of reality, and it's the underclass perhaps who live in a hyper real ontology?
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly that was what, when I talk about Andreessen in the book, he did this interview a couple of years ago where he talked about, we've done all sorts of things to try to increase equality, so people could have the same material wealth or similar, and we failed. So let's forget about that and let's just create virtual worlds where the great unwashed can kind of have a virtual experience of this wonderful, materially rich life that people like me actually experience in the real world. And I do think, which let me first say, seems like a very perverse way of thinking about life and society in general. And I try to criticize him for that. But what we're seeing now, more so than, certainly 10 years ago, is the consolidation of power, not just economic power, which Silicon Valley has been very good at generating for quite a while, but now also political power and power over the media. as you see people like Musk, or like Bezos buy big media properties, something that has been in the playbook for oligarchs and other rich people who want to have play a bigger role in society, bigger role in politics, have more power, has always been in their playbook. So I think we are getting to what seems to me a dangerous stage of the consolidation of power across money, media, and politics right
But is
now.
this, I wouldn't disagree with you. I don't think many people would. But is this in any way new, Nick? I mean, Aldous Huxley was warning us about reality privilege in the late 20s and 30s in Brave New World.
Right.
Hearst was buying up the media, Citizen Kane, blah, blah. You've heard all the arguments. What's different about this?
Well, I think it is the same phenomenon of people with a lot of wealth wanting also to have a lot of power, both to protect their wealth, but also simply to have power. So in some sense, it's not radically different. I guess if there is a big difference, it's that even though we thought that digital media and social media was going to democratize media and tear down the old gatekeepers, which in many ways it has, we've actually seen even greater consolidation of control over information flows when you have companies like Meta and X and Google being the new gatekeepers. And we saw when Musk bought Twitter, everybody thought he was foolish because he paid, I can't remember how much, 40 something billion dollars or something. But what we've seen recently is he's really reshaped Twitter to be kind of a megaphone for his own views. And so, yeah, this phenomenon, I think, is something that has replayed itself probably throughout history because people want power. But we've never had these kind of platforms that are shaping, discourse, shaping culture so deeply. And now with the arrival of, generative AI, where you suddenly can, start producing wholesale content for yourself, it does seem to be a new. If the phenomenon isn't altogether new, it's entering a new phase because of the different technologies, in particularly media technologies we have. And I don't know how it's going to play out.
Nick, your book is in many ways a critique of social media, certainly not the first or the last. The best-selling book in this area at the moment is, of course, John Haidt's book on Our Age of Anxiety, which is really about how social media tears us apart internally. Yours tends to be more in terms of externalities, social externalities. How does your argument confirm or perhaps challenge the arguments of social psychologists like Haidt on social media?
I mean, I think it's consistent with them. Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, is looking in particular at young people who have grown up with it, teenagers, people in the early 20s.
People who went to the Superblome and took photos and then put it on Instagram, right?
So my book's kind of the anxious generation for adults. So I'm bringing all of us into the discussion because I think one of the dangers, and this is not a critique of Haidt's work, I think it's very valuable, and it's actually changing the way people think about the relationship of the technology and smartphones and social media in young people, and it seems to be having an effect in getting phones out of schools and stuff. So I praise that. But the danger is that we see this whole thing in generational terms, like, oh, it's the kids who are having the problems, and it's the kids who are being affected. And what I'm trying to say is all of us are being affected by this in deep ways, psychologically, culturally, and socially. And we have to not only try to see how it's affecting us, but we have to realize that we're complicit in in all of these problems. It's not just a matter of algorithms and evil big tech companies imposing their will on us. We are exercising our will in a way that I think is often not in our best interests.
So you're suggesting then we should just put down our phones and read Heidegger instead?
I'm suggesting you should read Heidegger on your phone. No, I'm suggesting, I, I'm not the type of writer who kind of tries to explain a complex problem and then say, oh, here are 7 easy steps to take to solve the problem. I don't think that that the new world we've created with social media and with digital media in general is something that's going away. I don't think we, there's this one idea, oh, you can fix social media so it gets rid of the problems. Social media is not broken. It's operating exactly as a computer network is going to operate by maximizing the speed and volume of information exchange. So you can't fix this. So I do think, I guess there are 2 ways to approach this if you think it is a problem, and some people don't. Some people love it, I think. And one is to reduce your use of it. I think we've bought into this idea that, oh, because a computer can do everything, then it must be the best tool for everything. So let's use it for all our communication, for talking to friends and family, for sharing political views, for debating people. I would argue that actually computers and computer networks are good tools for certain things, but there's a whole lot of things, particularly intimate aspects of our life, that they're really bad tools for. And our big mistake is thinking, oh, what we need in communication is more efficiency and more volume. Actually, that's not what you need when you're communicating. You need more thoughtfulness. You actually need more quiet time to collect your thoughts and to be able to kind of think about other people and think about your own thoughts and try to express them well. So we've bought into this industrial ideal of, oh, let's make our communication and information exchange as efficient as possible, and somehow that's going to be good. And so I think you can be more deliberate. We can, as individuals, about what you use the technology for, what you use your phone for, what you use social media for, and what you don't. That's one aspect of it. The other, which is completely speculative, that I'd suggest, is that whenever you have this force that has such social and cultural dominance as digital technology does now, you set the stage for a counterculture. And so I wouldn't be surprised if, the children of millennials or the children of Gen Z or whatever it is, we see a generation come along and say, screw this. I don't want to walk around with a phone in my face all the time like adults do, and simply reject it all. And so that might be wishful thinking on my part, but
the sort of vinylification of social media.
Right. Just say, to hell with it. This looks really stupid, and adults have wrapped themselves in this world that distances themselves from the stuff that actually is meaningful. So why don't we, as young people, say no?
Well, we should say no, Nick, maybe, and then put David Bowie's Aladdin Sane on the gramophone and use an old vinyl. I actually have a vinyl record of Aladdin Sane, because you quote Aladdin Sane at Drive-In Saturday at the beginning of the book, which I love this quote, and I'm going to repeat it. Let me put my arms around your head. Gee, it's hot. Let's go to bed. Don't forget to turn on the light. Don't laugh, babe. It'll be all right. Pour me out another phone. I'll ring and see if your friends are home. How did Bowie get this before anyone else? I mean, Aladdin Sane came out in 1973 or 4.
Yeah, I think it was 73. And I also still have a vinyl copy. But
well, we're both of the same generation. I bet we both love David Bowie and Aladdin Sane.
But to me, back in those days when you actually had to go out and buy a record, and you had a very close attachment to it, and you tended to study it and stuff. And so that line always seemed kind of mysterious to me. Pour me out another phone. And slowly,
it's a brilliant
again, this
line.
is an example of the world catching up to Bowie. It just kind of encapsulates this kind of liquefaction. This is another term I use in the book. This liquefaction of everything into information, and it just, yeah, pour me out another phone. I love that line.
Yeah. Wow. Finally, there was a wonderful piece we talked about this before we went live in the New Yorker this week by Daniel Immerwahr. What if the attention crisis is all a distraction? And it talks about your great work, The Shallows, and he even, and this was a great compliment to you, he talks about a cohort of people who followed the. You say he writes, Carr set off an avalanche on this ruined attention economy where we're all looking at our phones, and in some ways it's not actually the Super Bloom is a natural next chapter in The Shallows. How did you respond to Immerwahr's argument that the attention crisis is exaggerated and that we're still looking at 3-hour films like The Brutalist? How does this connect to the arguments both in The Shallows and in Super Bloom?
Well, I mean, I fundamentally disagree with him that somehow this isn't a problem, but I think he does a very valuable service in showing that there are different ways of paying attention. I think we've been a little too superficial in just talking about attention as if it was this one thing, and that, you know, reading a book is the same thing as watching a movie or playing a video game. And these are different forms of attention. But I think that, yeah, you can get involved in, you know, a long TV series or a movie, and that's great. But it doesn't change the fact that that we are in a environment of constant interruption and distraction. And rather than, I mean, he ultimately says, and this seems kind of odd to me, that by talking about distraction, we're distracting ourselves from the deeper problems of the technology. And in some ways, you know, I agree that if you were only talking about distraction, we're missing things. And one of the things I'm trying to do with Super Bloom is show that it's not just about distraction. But I would argue that our focus on distraction, rather than drawing us away from a critique of technology, has actually helped us realize that there are negative consequences of our compulsive use of the technology. And then once you see that, you can go from distraction and the loss of attention itself to a much broader critique. So I think to me, the whole article I thought was very valuable, as I said, but he seemed very ambivalent about his critique of the attention discourse. And I think it's because attention is we use a single word for what are lots of different mental and social phenomena. And I think it is important to realize the differences. But at this point, to say that somehow we're not particularly distracted, or that our train of thought isn't being broken all the time, is simply wrong, I think. You know, it wasn't that long ago when there was time in your day, and it wasn't just when you went to a movie theater, when you were alone with your thoughts. You weren't socializing because there weren't people there. Now that we all have our phones with us, we socialize all the time. So we don't even have those kind of time in our life when we can allow our when we can daydream, when we can allow our thoughts to jump from one thing to another. And I agree that might look like distraction itself, but having the ability to let your mind wander without being interrupted is very important, I think, to leading a full intellectual life. But even that kind of productive mind wandering gets disrupted when you have to grab your phone to see what the latest message is, or the latest headline, or whatever. So I saw it as a valuable article, but perhaps misaimed.
Yeah, well, it was more a review of Chris Hayes's new book on attention. And finally, Nick, you don't want to be seen as a futurist, so you don't want to speculate on the future. So let me do that. I wonder whether in the future, maybe in 20 or 30 years, as AI really plays itself out, we'll look back at the social media age as the last truly human one. And for all the annoyance and absurdity of TikTok or Instagram and your points about Superbloom, it will be the last period in human history where we won't have to compete with smart machines.
I guess I don't know. I mean, one thing, as you were saying that, one thing that became clear to me that I should I should say is that I'm not opposed to people having fun with their phones, and I'm not opposed to
I mean, we
people
could do this on our phone. I
running
insist usually my guests don't go on
running
the
out and
phone, but
taking
it's
pictures of
doable.
flowers. If those things were part of a richer, more diverse experience of life, that so you weren't seeing everything and doing everything through your phone and being distracted, but they were parts of a life that had many different parts and many different experiences, many different ways of experiencing. And to me, that's the problem: is that more and more the phone, the technology, social media is always there as a kind of screen between us, even if we aren't looking literally at the screen. But yeah, it's true. As I don't know how AI is going to play out. I think there's a lot of jumping to conclusions about, that the power of these systems is just going to continue to go up at an exponential rate, and that rarely happens in technology. So I'm not particularly concerned with, the sudden arrival of artificial general intelligence, and our machines are not only generating a bunch of words and pictures and stuff, but are actually have self-consciousness and self-awareness, and kind of displace us in a way. It does seem to me that, when we see people, that now that we can have a machine talk for us and think for us, will we pause, or will we, if we're going to go to a wedding and we're the parent of the bride or the groom, will we just let the chatbot compose the remarks we have? Will the bride and groom use it to compose their vows? Will it just displace anything that requires some effort and some attempt to get into your deeper thoughts and your deeper emotions and stuff, because it's just so fast and so easy? I've seen people say, "Oh, well, we're starting to see the democratization rhetoric playing out with AI, that, oh, people used to a lot of people had to struggle with writing well, or whatever. So at least this way, this will open up the ability to write well, even if the machine is doing the writing for them." And it seems to me that's a very dangerous point of view, because it basically says that you don't have to make an effort. Talent isn't important. Let the machine do it for you. And you'll have this kind of false experience of what it's like to work hard to be a writer or an artist or whatever. So I think it is a dangerous moment right now.
Well, it may well be. Nicholas Carr, the author of Superbloom. One thing I can say for sure is when you talk to Nick or when you listen to him, our minds superbloom. So congratulations, Nick, on the new book. And we will look forward to talking to you again. I'm particularly interested in your take on the AI revolution. Thank you so much, and congratulations again on Superbloom.
Thanks very much, Andrew. My pleasure.